Ken Esterow. I'm an operating partner with TZP, a lower middle market sponsor based here in New York City that invests in business and consumer services. We manage about $2 billion of capital. One of the exercises I undertook about a year ago was to look back at our 50 or so transactions and try to identify what the most important factors were with respect to outcomes, returns. We looked at historical financial performance, projected financial performance. We looked at industry sector, the deal partner who sourced the deal, how long the deal took to consummate, what the percent of seller rollover was, 15 factors. And we engaged the Columbia School of Engineering's operations research team to run a multi-factor regression analysis. And not surprisingly to me as a former operating executive, but I think surprising to our deal teams, is 3 of our 4 most important factors. Oh, bear with me. There we go. 3 of our most important factors out of more than 20 that we looked at related to the capabilities of the executive team, the experience of the executive team, and the capabilities and leadership of the CEO. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce Joel Trammell. Joel's a 3-time CEO who has authored, 3 books, 4 books?
Great.
Including one that is a great read called The Chief Executive Operating System. We had Joel join our CEO Roundtable where we brought 25 of our CEOs to hear Joel's thoughts on leadership and structure. So with that, Joel.
As you will quickly deduce, I'm not from around here, and so every time I come to New York, I can't help but think about 9/11. I'm sure most of you in the room remember where you were on that day, horrible day. I was in Atlanta at a networking trade show introducing the second product for my startup company. I was waiting to hear Jack Welch speak. He was introducing his book. Jack had just retired from GE, and I wanted to hear his thoughts on the CEO role. And of course, the towers get hit, and the whole world changes. So I spend the next year at my startup running around the country trying to sell these IT products to Fortune 2000 type companies, right? And it's damn near impossible. Now I remember a meeting with a Fortune 500 CIO, multi-billion-dollar budget personally for his department. We're giving the presentation. He looks at me, he says, Joel, this is the best product I've ever seen from a startup. And I'm like, here's the contract, sign here, press hard. And then he adds, if it costs $1, I can't buy it. Oh, great, okay. So September 2002, I go to my board. The first agenda on the board item is, hey guys, I've got $3 million in the bank. If it was my money, I'd take it and go home. Because I think I've got a great team, I think I've got a great product, I think I've got, it's a great market, but right now nobody's buying anything, and I don't know what to do. Famously, my board chair looks at me, he goes, we got a checkbook. If you need more money, let us know. You can hear the emotion in my voice today, 20-something years later. That was my career right there. Who I got money from made all the difference. So fast forward a few years, this gentleman's chairman of a public company. He calls me up, he says, Joel, I need your help. I need you to be on the board of this public company. Last thing I really wanted to do was be on the board of a public company, but I owed him, right? So I said, sure, I'll be on the board of the public company. So the public company was, of course, struggling. They were going through a CEO transition, brought in a new CEO. CEO's been there a couple of quarters. He tells us he needs a new strategy. We need to hire McKinsey, pay them $1 million. They're going to come produce this great strategy for the company. So they do all their work. They produce all their beautiful PowerPoints. They come into the board meeting. They present this strategy. The PowerPoints were pretty. The analysis was probably strong, but the company had much deeper problems. So a couple of days after the board meeting, the CEO calls me up. He says, Joel, how did you think of the strategy? What did you think of it? I said, it's okay. I said, but how long have you been CEO? He said, I've been here about a year. I said, what have you done to change your product in a year that you've been CEO? And he thought I was confused at first. He said, well, Joel, we're not a product company. We're a service company. And I said, yeah, I understand. Your product is a technician going out to somebody's location and running some cable or installing a server. They were an IT services business, had 1,000 of these technicians all around the country. I said, what have you done to change the behavior of any one of those 1,000 technicians in the company? And what did I hear? Silence on the other end of the phone. Man had been CEO of the company for a year, but he had never even thought about how he changed his fundamental product. And so that gets to the heart of what we're going to talk about today is how do you think about the CEO role? What the heck do these CEOs do? It's often very hard to figure out, and I've spent 30 years studying the job, multiple years doing the job, and about the last 15 years teaching the job. And so here's what I've come up with in the 15 minutes I got left to tell you. There's obviously a lot more behind this, but first, do we have a reasonable, and I should say executive team dynamics, do we have a reasonable model of how a business operates? Now, I don't want to get in an argument with a dead man, but Milton Friedman famously said many years ago that the purpose of the company was to maximize shareholder value, right? And there have been arguments through the years, is that really the purpose of a company? Is it to maximize shareholder value, or there's other concerns? And I say, well, first of all, really the purpose of any organization, any organism, is really first to survive and then to thrive, okay? So let's think about survive and thrive instead of maximizing profits. Maximizing profits may be something we want to do, but first we've got to survive and thrive. And in my experience, the only way you can survive and thrive as an organization, a business, is to consistently provide value to three groups. You have to consistently provide value to customers, because if you don't have customers, if they leave you, you don't have a business. You've got to consistently provide value to employees, because if they leave you, you don't have a business. And you got to consistently provide value to shareholders. And the reason that part of the CEO job is so different is most jobs are single variable optimization jobs. The head of sales, his job is to generate more revenues good, less revenues bad, right? The problem with the CEO job is you've got to balance these three competing interests. We call them a triangle of tension. You've got any decision you make, any resource you allocate, typically could go to customers, could be assigned to employees, could be assigned to shareholders. And you've got to constantly keep that in balance. And what 95% of the companies do is they don't keep that in balance. Most of them, if they're venture-backed or private equity-backed, think in terms of shareholder value. Hey, I want to maximize shareholder, and they have their 5-year strategic plan for shareholders. But if you understand this model, you'd be asking, where's your 5-year plan to provide value to customers? Where's your 5-year plan to provide value to employees? Because all of those are just as important. And so that's the triangle on the left. Again, we call it a triangle of tension because it's this balancing act. And I'm asking every CEO and executive team when I talk to them, hey, how is this decision going to affect customers as a group, employees as a group, and shareholders as a group? And then the right-hand side is the internal triangle of tension that every CEO has to manage. And every company I've ever been associated with has an argument between the sales guys who want to sell anything because that's what they get commissioned on, the product team who's trying to deliver this thing for as low as cost as possible, and the marketing team that's caught in the middle. And I know that half my money in marketing is wasted, I just don't know which half, right? And so there's this constant tension that's occurring internally. And you say, well, this doesn't look very complicated, Joel. You got two triangles. What's the difference? Well, most people, I think, operate under a single triangle model. Most people operate under the model in their head, hey, I have this product or service. I try to sell that product or service, and I try to do it without running out of money. And that works in the startup phase. If you're a startup CEO, I tell you, just go do that and don't think about anything else. But once you get to any significant size, and once you get product market fit, you've got to worry about these two triangles. And when you have one triangle, there are only 3 different ways those groups can interact with 3 items. But it turns out when you have 2 triangles with 6 items, there are 15 different interactions of those groups. And so fundamentally what a CEO should be doing is looking at each of these groups, and I talk about them being wheels on a vehicle. So imagine you had a 6-wheeled vehicle. On the left, we got the customer wheel, the employee wheel, and the shareholder wheel. On the right, we got the product wheel, the sales wheel, and the marketing wheel. And I'm always thinking which one of those wheels is turning the slowest. Okay, where do I need to dedicate my efforts? And then of course I speed up that wheel, and what inevitably happens? Well, it's going faster, I got to chase another one, right? I'm playing whack-a-mole on which wheel's the slowest. But if you don't have this comprehensive view of the business, you make a lot of mistakes. And a lot of people who get in the CEO role have never had any training on the role. And so how do they view it? Well, if they're a salesperson, they view the CEO role as a bigger sales role. And that sales is the only thing that matters, and then there's everything else. There's other. Okay? And I'll go do sales. Or if they're a finance person, what do they view? They view shareholder, they view all the financial metrics. That's all that's important, right? And then there's everything else to the business. And I would argue, no, you can't run a vehicle with just one wheel. Okay? It doesn't work. You got to have all six turning, and they've got to all be turning roughly the same speed to be effective. This model has all kinds of implications. I could spend an hour just talking about implications. But I'll tell you this, 90% of the time a CEO walks in my office and expresses some problem they're having and wants my help, we end up looking at this model and finding out they've done something that violates this model. They've got a customer success executive that reports to sales instead of reporting directly to the CEO. Okay, well, then you've got a junior sales guy. You don't have anybody representing the customer at the executive table. They've got an HR person that's reporting to the CFO because they view HR as cost, not employee productivity. And so you've got a problem there with your employees, right? Almost any business failure you see, let's take Boeing. What's Boeing going through right now? What did they do? They hired a couple of CEOs who had great financial backgrounds, who tried to squeeze every penny of it, and they forgot about customers, and they can't ship planes, and they're about to crater Southwest Airlines because of their mistakes, because they can't ship 737s to Southwest Airlines, and their unions on strike, because they didn't worry about how to provide value to employees, right? So anytime you see a business failure, it often comes. And then the last comment I'll make on this slide is people argue about what strategy is all the time. I have a pretty simple definition on strategy. Strategy is everything, every decision you make on the right-hand triangle to provide value to the left-hand triangle. Okay? And so every decision you make about what product we build, how we're going to sell it, how we're going to market it, who our customer is, all those things inevitably should be focused on providing value to the left-hand side of this equation. And then to answer the second question, what do CEOs really do? I sat down about 12 years ago to write a book. I thought I would find out that Harvard had a model and Stanford had a model, and I'd come in as the practical guy and say, you academics don't know what you're talking about, right? I found out neither one of them had a model, because none of the academics ever read anything. And so, yeah, they'll produce all kinds of literature on very narrow pieces of the puzzle, but they never laid out a model of what a CEO really does. And so I may give you 5 things that I think a CEO does and has to do and can't delegate. And one way to evaluate CEOs in your businesses is to think about how well they do on each of these 5 areas. So the first one is own the vision. Some people might call this strategy, but to me it's bigger than strategy. It's everything around it. It's mission, vision, values, how we look at the market different, what are our strategic objectives, how do we balance customers, shareholders, and employees. Second, provide the resources. The resources are mostly, these days, people. Human capital is 70 or 80% of the expenses in many of the businesses you guys are involved with. Also, obviously, capital is the other key resource. There are other things we could talk about, but the CEO's got to take ownership of making sure that the business has the right human resources and the right capital resources to pursue the value. Number 3, the CEO's responsible for the culture, developing the culture, improving the culture, building the culture if it's an early stage company. The CEO, I think the CEO is the mayor and the chief of police of the community. I don't use a family analogy for businesses. There are people in my family that I wouldn't choose to have in my family. CEO doesn't have to deal with that in the business world, right? So I talk about it as a community. It's a place where people want to associate, and you're both the mayor and the chief of police, right? You're the enforcer, you're setting the bar, and you're determining what is valued in the organization. Number 4, build a decision-making organization. One of the fundamental changes that happens that I don't hear talked about a lot to explain the difference between running a company with 25 people and running a company with 250 people is when you're running a company with 25 people, most of the time you can keep track of what everybody's doing. You know everybody, and so the standard model is I'm going to feed all the data up to the CEO. I'm going to have them make all the decisions with that data, and then I just need a bunch of doers to go execute those decisions. When you get to 250 though, it's impossible to process all that data, to know what everybody's doing, and so you got to turn the model on its head. And the model on its head at 250 plus should be, I have to pass the decision-making criteria down to the organization such that every manager in the organization would make the same decision I would make if they were standing there looking over my shoulder, because I can't pass the data up. And so fundamentally what a good CEO does is train that whole management team on how to make the exact same decision they would make if they were sitting there standing over their shoulder. And that's a good test in an organization. If you see a bunch of people making decisions that are different than what you as CEO would make, that's a good sign. You haven't trained that organization very well, and you haven't built a great decision-making organization. And then finally, number 5, deliver predictable performance. The word that's very important here is predictable. Everybody would say the job of the CEO is to deliver performance. Sure, but predictable is the key. If one quarter you're $1 million up, next quarter you're $1 million down, that's a really tough business to run, and really hard to actually use the resources as efficiently as possible. So how do you build predictability in a business? Well, you'd have to go through the whole course, but there's a methodology around that. And it really revolves around making everybody in the company produce a forecast. I was sitting in an executive team meeting one day, and for the 100th time you sat in the same meeting, and we go around the room and everybody tells me how great everybody on their team is and how they're knocking it out of the park. But then we would spend like 90% of our time on the sales forecast. And I was always like, why aren't we always talking about the sales forecast? I mean, I think all these pieces are important, right? I don't think sales is the only thing that's important in the business. Yeah, we got to have sales, but we got to have all these other things too. Why do we spend 90% of our time talking about sales forecast? And the aha moment for me was the idea that sales, by process, was the only group that was giving me information about the future. And this concept of information about the future is really important. When you're the leader of an organization, you're the bus driver, you're looking out the front window, telling me what happened yesterday, I don't care, okay? I don't care that I hit something back there. As long as the bus is still running, I'm trying to avoid the pothole in the road. So as CEO, I need information about the future. I need people to project and predict where we're going to be using the best data they have available, but not limited to data, because data is by definition historical. And so great companies run with CEOs that are spending 80% of their time managing the future, 20% of their time dealing with the tactical issues of today and yesterday. Observe your companies and see if your CEOs are spending that 80% of the time in the future, or if they're spending 100% of their time playing whack-a-mole with the problem of the day.